Good evening, everybody. My name's Peter Robertson, and as I mentioned, I'm an economic rationalist. I'm also hopefully a future academic, and what I want to do tonight is hopefully persuade you of the value of my research. So hopefully I've taken something away from the first speaker there. Today what we're going to talk about is China's military capacity. So allow me just to find this slide. Okay, so why China's economic military capacity? Well, clearly China's on the rise. It's one of the most sort of headline subjects, China's rise in the media in the last few years. China's passing all sorts of targets compared to the USA in terms of its GDP, its share of world investment, its share of world manufacturing, and so forth. But with all this economic growth comes the growth in military tensions. There's economic tensions. There's tensions in the South China Sea over resources. There's tensions in the East China Sea, as we know, over islands between Japan and China. And there's a lot of tension tonight as we speak with China and Vietnam in the same region. So China, is interested in securing its resources for the future. It doesn't have a lot of resources. It tends to rely on imports, so it wants a naval capacity. It wants, like the USA does, to be able to project power. And as a future world leader, it doesn't want to be in a situation where it can't have some impact on global foreign affairs, the way that the USA can, for example. So what China's doing is clearly changing the balance of power. And the USA has responded to this with the Clinton-Obama pivot to Asia. The USA is now looking at Asia as a region where it needs to invest more of its security resources. So this is the kind of headline that we get fairly regularly now. This is just a couple of months ago. China announces a 12% increase in its military budget. And it's the kind of headline that is sending ripples of concern across the Western world against the backdrop of these rising tensions, and also China's seemingly infinite scope at the moment to keep spending on military goods like this. So with this kind of tension and this kind of rise and the rise of a new superpower, there's always a chance for miscommunication, there's chances for mistakes, there's chances for escalation of conflict. And so in this kind of environment, getting correct information is very important. And what I want to spend the next couple of minutes talking about is what that 12.2% increase in military spending actually means. All right? So for comparison, USA's increase is probably about 2%, Australia's might be about 0%, except thanks to the recent budget, it's now much bigger than 0%, but it's nothing compared to 12%. So this is the question: what do these increases mean in terms of real military expansion? Because this is just a dollar amount, or in this case, measured in Chinese RMB. What does it mean in real terms? What in absolute real terms or relative to the United States? Does it mean that how fast is China catching up? And the usual approaches to doing this in the literature, well, you can take that 12% and you just deflate it using an inflation rate. So you say, well, the rate of inflation is about 2%, so 12% is really about 10% real growth. The rest is just price increases. Or you could convert that number to, which is in Chinese yuan, or RMBs, into dollars, using, say, a market exchange rate. And then you'd have $148 billion, which is what the article back here talks about. And that's how much measured in sort of US dollar terms of how much China's expanding its military that we can compare with US military expansion directly. Or you could look at the price levels in each country. This is the sort of preferred method by economists, because the exchange rate doesn't really measure the right sort of doesn't really capture the differences in prices in each country. A lot of things in China are very, very cheap, and the exchange rate really captures the relative price of traded goods only. A lot of things in the military are non-traded. And so you could use the index of prices. You measure the prices in each country, and you deflate by that price index in each country. Now, which method you use makes an enormous difference in the sort of real expansion number that you get. So, for example, in the first bar here, it says 120%. That's the growth in Chinese military spending versus, or real terms, versus the United States from 2000 to 2010. So it says that if you take all the increases in spending in Chinese yuan, convert them to US dollars, relative exchange rate, using the relative exchange rate, and then compare that to the growth of US military, it says that Chinese military expansion has been twice as much, more than twice as much, more than 100% compared to the United States. But if you take into account the fact that you don't want to really look at exchange rates and you look at different prices in each country and you use this, what I call a PPP exchange rate, then you get a much, still large number. It's gone up about 60%, but it's certainly a much lower number. So the difference between these two things is mainly the fact that the renminbi has appreciated against the US exchange rate, and so Chinese spending looks to be a bigger number, even though it might buy the same amount of goods in China. So that's a big difference. So, but neither of these numbers is actually the right one to use. Okay? Experts can't agree on what the right number is, or of these two numbers, which one is the most accurate. And when I say experts, I mean the US Department of Defense, the RAND Corporation, and so forth. Now, the ideal measure to use to take military spending in, say, dollars or RMB, any kind of unit of currency, and convert it to some real measure, would be something like a military price index. So what you need is the price of all the inputs going into the military services to produce defence services. So the defence is a firm, they buy inputs, and you want to deflate the spending by the increase in the price of all the inputs that the actual military establishment purchases. Now, that would be nice to have because that sort of data usually is a state secret, and the Chinese aren't going to tell me. So I did write them a letter, but they didn't reply. So the aim here then is to construct the best thing I can get, the closest thing I get to that index. And I can do that because I know something about the type of things that military establishments do buy. They buy equipment, right? So that's their missiles from Russia, for example, and various other technologies. And they spend a lot of money on housing and road building and warehouses and things like this. And the rest of it is all on personnel, mostly soldiers, of course, but also administrators, cooks, and so forth. About 1/3 of China's military budget is just spent on personnel. Right? They have twice as many soldiers as what the United States does. It's a very sort of labour-intensive military force. And so a lot of their costs are actually just wage costs, wages of the soldiers. So with that in mind, we can construct a sort of index. Now, to give you an idea of what goes into this index, I've got here the two numbers we were looking at before. On the top line here is the growth in military spending. So you can see this is through from the 1980s, but it's tracking around about 15% every year. Okay? And then down at the bottom here we have the inflation rate for China, which is just the average inflation rate for all goods produced in China. And that's about 3 or 4% per year on average. And so the difference to those things would normally be taken as a real measure. Take the nominal growth minus the price increase, and you get the real increase in military capacity. And so that's going to be a number like we had around 12 or 10%. But remember what I said, that most of the costs in the military are actually wage costs. So let's look at the growth rate of wages in China. That's the blue line. Right, can you see the blue line? Some people are squinting. Right? So the blue line there tracks nicely along the red line. That is to say that the growth rate of wages in China is almost the same rate as, well, pretty much is the same rate as the growth rate of military spending. What does that mean? That means a lot of these costs, remember labour is 1/3 of the entire budget, a lot of this increase in spending is going into what? It's going into higher salaries for the soldiers. Why would China pay its soldiers higher salaries? Well, because people are getting very, very high wages in manufacturing when manufacturing is booming. So in order to keep people happy and employed in the military, they have to keep the wages of the soldiers going up at the same rate. And this is what China complains about all the time in its defence documents, that it's facing higher labour costs, has to pay its soldiers pensions, they want better living conditions, and so forth. So wages in China are rising very rapidly. And you can see, if you imagine if you had a peasant army, this is the extreme example, the peasant army just consisting of soldiers, like the Romans or the Greeks, right? And you had this data, and you said, well, this is my spending on the army. Julius Caesar's increased his spending 15% every year, right? And at the same time, Julius Caesar's facing 15% in his wage costs every year, then his real military growth would be 0. Okay? Now, that's not exactly true for China, but there's something like that going on. So what I've done is combine this information into a price index using some economic theory, which tells me how I can do that in a sensible way, and we get the following results. So this is the results I had before. This is the growth of China's military relative to the US using market exchange rate measures. This was using a basic inflation rate measure, and when we incorporate the high growth of wages in a sensible way, using the budget shares for labour in the Chinese military, we get a growth rate of this, which is about 25%. Okay? So yes, China's military is growing. Yes, it is spending a lot of RMB on its military capacity, but the actual real growth implied by that is not nearly as large as what people are saying it is, or what they're thinking it is, because a lot of that is just going as higher wages to soldiers. So in economics we call this example of cost disease. It's a well-known phenomenon. When you get growth in one sector, there's a lot of productivity growth in China's manufacturing. In the other sectors, they've got to match the wages, even if they don't have the productivity growth. Right. So this is like paying higher wages for plumbers. Right? Plumbers get higher wages because they can get jobs in the mining sector, even if they're living in Sydney. Right? So you pay for the same plumbing services, but you don't get any better quality, but you've got to pay them a lot more because some of them can get jobs in the mining sector. So the cost of retaining personnel is increasing due to this productivity growth in manufacturing. And this also explains, to some extent, why China is modernising its military. It's modernising its military because wages are getting more expensive. And so it makes sense to substitute towards other technologies like equipment that's now relatively cheaper compared to what it used to be. So that's the end. Thank you very much.